One of the phrases that bugs me is my truth. And it's not because there's nothing to the idea of like, oh, you have your perspective and you need to speak your feelings and so on. It's because it takes away from our shared reality. When we get away from talking about the truth, we set ourselves up for situations where we have difficulty standing our ground. And we end up sharing things, pouring our heart into things where that's not going to be appreciated, where the other party isn't going to be receptive to us. I think when people adopt this phrase, they're doing it with the intention of empowering themselves. And it can be very empowering to stand in my truth, to acknowledge in a moment something that I've denied for so long, feelings I've denied my entire life, perspectives that I've kept quiet about my entire life. But if it's just my perspective versus someone else's perspective, then it's strictly a battle of emotion and will. So when you're dealing with a narcissist or any other pathological personality type, they don't care about your truth. They don't care about what you feel. And no matter how much you realize that, I know for me, if I go into a discussion with the idea that I'm going to express my truth to the other person, I am shifting in a way where I become receptive to their point of view. I'm too empathetic to just turn that off. So if I'm receptive to their point of view, and I'm dealing either with a pathological person or a toxic person that cannot see and own their patterns, then it doesn't matter how eloquently I've expressed myself. It doesn't matter how well I've made my case. It doesn't matter how many times I have outlined what hurt me and what I would like to change. The second they say anything back to me, I absorb that like a sponge because I'm in the wrong state to stand my ground. Now, in terms of reality, I don't think that there is anything as a strictly objective truth. I also don't think that there is anything such as a strictly subjective individual truth that gets to dominate everyone else's. This is a co-creation. This is a shared reality. And in a shared reality, there are facts. There are things that I can outline, that I can make a bullet point list out of, that cannot be avoided, that cannot be spun, that cannot be denied. Earlier this year, I dealt with somebody who wanted to get too close to me too quickly. I was very uncomfortable with that entire process, and I made that known several times over. I had a suspicion that there wouldn't be, well, to be frank about it, I figured that, okay, if I really speak my mind on this friendship isn't going to hold together. And I hit a point where I didn't even want it to hold together. If there wasn't going to be change, it needed to go. I didn't demonize the other person. I identified many things that were manipulative, that came across to me as being cutting remarks. But the way that they conducted themselves, they had a lot of plausible deniability. And part of how this was able to carry on for as long as it did is because I was willing to assume the best and allow them that plausible deniability. When I took a step back and I thought about how I either wanted to proceed with this friendship or dissolve it, I realized I needed to document things, I needed to outline the facts, and I needed to stick to that. And in sticking to that, I did not get emotionally invested in the moment that it was time to have that conversation. Here's another trap when it comes to my truth, especially when you have to confront someone who isn't willing to hear you or who isn't willing to take an honest look at themselves. If I confront them, if I try to call them out, if I try to expose them, I'm investing way too much of my emotional energy into that. in order to keep my center and to be effective in the moment when I need to be thinking clearly. If I stick to the facts that I've documented that I can outline, if I'm less invested on labeling them and more invested in saying, here is what has happened. Here are the number of times that I've asked you to stop this. Here are the ways I've asked you to change. That hasn't happened. I don't hate you, but this needs to shift. When you do that, instead of exposing them, what ends up happening is they will expose themselves. Now, depending on the circumstance you find yourself in, you'll want to be careful with that. With most narcissists and pathological types, they will fold when they're confronted in that way. When they are confronted with reality and you stick to reality and you don't budge, but there are some who are fully aware of who they are and what they're doing, and confronting them in that way will just piss them off. You won't necessarily know what you're dealing with until the conversation is had. So what I would advise is that if getting the hell out of Dodge isn't an option for you, or it wouldn't be something that a decent person would do, document everything ahead of time. And if you feel bad about documenting things, I want you to keep in mind, if you're dealing with an actually consciously pathological personality type or a deeply toxic unconscious personality type, they will think nothing of documenting every photo you post on social media, recording conversations that you've had without your knowledge, keeping tabs on every single text message that you ever send them, all with a mind for how they can potentially use this against you if they ever have to. There's nothing immoral, there is nothing inherently evil about taking steps to ensure that if you ever need documentation, that you've got it. Because your best defense against any pathological personality type is going to be reality. Not your truth, but the reality of the situation as it exists within our shared co-created world. Now, where your truth is going to be more valid and where, in terms of how I personally think of it, of course, there are things that are unique to you, that will be about yourself, that only you are supposed to see, or only those closest to you are supposed to see. Things where if you share them, you only share them with the people who are closest to you, that you trust the most. Things that in many ways I would consider sacred. That's what I think of when I think of my truth. In terms of our shared reality, this emphasis on my truth versus your truth, I think that it's encouraged this more narcissistic approach that a lot of people have taken to life and to their relationships. I think it's made it harder for us to relate to each other because we get so wrapped up in our own worlds that we forget about the world that we share with each other. And we don't put the work into cultivating a shared world that is mutually beneficial to all of us, as opposed to something that caters to us individually. And yes, in the past, we've lived in this sort of collective co-created world that was very much dominated by singular personalities or ideologies that were not good for us. So we had to take into account that these patterns that have emerged, they've emerged as a response to a very toxic world that we grew up in. But that doesn't mean that abandoning the idea of there being a truth outside of us, that in many situations, even in personal relationships, can be more important than the truth that exists solely within us, that hasn't benefited us. We're a social species, and if we want to thrive, we need to be able to bond with other people and find a middle ground where it's not just my truth versus your truth, but it's a shared truth. a shared truth within a co-created reality, and not isolated factions all vying for dominance. In the current times, we've seen the pendulum swing from one extreme to another extreme, which is in many ways identical to the paradigm that we left behind. In the paradigm that we left behind here in the United States, here in the West, by and large, it was one very narcissistic God at the head of the biggest religion. And that religion made the rules, and anybody, like any patriarch of any tribe, they tended to act exactly like they were the avatar of this God. As if, well, it turns out that what this guy wants is exactly what I want. And throwing that in the trash bin of history was a good thing. But taking that attitude and franchising it isn't an improvement, even if it is an understandable counter-reaction to it. By all means, you as an individual, you are sacred. What goes on inside of you, what happens in your life, it's important. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. We can't have a harmonious co-created reality where you as an individual are not accounted for at all. But also keep in mind how such a hyper-focus on that can weaken you and prevent you from being able to stand your ground when it comes to breaking loops that you are currently in, or seeing loops that you've broken out of clearly and want to ensure that you never repeat. This is a prime example of those things that I've talked about where I'm not your guru. This is not the truth. I'm not imposing my perspective on you. If you don't see things the way I do, if this video is not of particular value to you, that's great. Yeah, stick to what you're doing. This is solely about offering a fresh perspective. And I'm hoping that this will spark conversation, especially down in the comments, because I would love to hear what other people have to say about this topic. As always, it's been good speaking with y'all. Leave a like down below and subscribe if you haven't yet. I'll see you tomorrow with another video.